Some major breaking news put out by President Trump just this morning. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. A new statement. Quote, wow, on Sunday night, while I was with my family, having just arrived from Turning Point, an event in Florida, where I won a straw poll, blah, 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 about the beating Biden. Quote, deranged Jack Smith, the prosecutor with Joe Biden's DOJ, sent a letter, again, it was a Sunday night, stating, I am a target, all caps, of the January 6th grand jury investigation, giving me 4 short days to report to a grand jury, which almost always means arrest and indictment. So, quote, now Joe Biden's Attorney General Merrick Garland, who I turned down for the U.S. Supreme Court, together with Biden's Department of Justice, has issued a 3rd indictment and arrest, effectively, of Joe Biden's #1 political opponent who is dominating him in the race. So clearly, Krystal, the last time we saw a target letter that happened in the documents investigation, he was almost indicted almost immediately. So it could be that this is happening very soon. He's also being summoned here to Washington to appear before this grand jury investigation. This was previously handled in Florida, which is part of the reason the machinations there were around the classified documents case. This is about the January 6th investigation, which takes place here in D.C. This is after, quote, dozens of witnesses have appeared to testify before the federal grand jury about, quote, Trump and his allies' effort to thwart election loss. So this is almost certainly, Krystal, I believe, going to focus on the so-called false elector scheme and around defrauding or attempting to or conspiring to stop a U.S. government procedure.
Yeah, so this is the New York Times analysis, because you're right, the charges here are going to be interesting.
Yeah, they're confusing, actually.
Yeah, more surprising or interesting than the ones with regard to the documents, which we kind of had a good sense of what might be charged there. They say that we don't know what charges Smith is considering, ranging from the House committee that investigated the January 6th riot to outsiders writing model prosecution memos. They focused in particular on the possibility of the attempted corrupt obstruction of an official proceeding and conspiracy to defraud the government. That would be under Section 371 of Title 18. They go on to say charges of obstructing an official proceeding, that would be Congress's session to count the electoral votes, those have already been brought against some January 6th rioters. So you've had rioters who've already been charged with obstructing an official proceeding. Charges of defrauding the government could get into broader actions before January 6th, like the scheme to have Trump supporters pretend to be alternative slates of official electors from contested states. So you think about like the Georgia fake elector scheme, that there's a separate grand jury that's investigating that as well. Another thing that's been widely discussed, including in the House January 6th Committee's referral to the Justice Department, is insurrection under Section 2383 of Title 18, which makes it a crime to incite, assist, or aid in comfort in insurrection against the authority and laws of the federal government. That offense, however, is rarely charged and has not been brought against any January 6th rioters to date. So that would be sort of like the most maximalist position that they could take. And frankly, it would require, I think that would probably be the most difficult charge to prove, just because of the high bar that is set there. So more likely we're looking at something like, the conspiracy to defraud the government or attempted corrupt obstruction of an official proceeding. And, frankly, given that those charges have already stuck to certain January 6th rioters, Trump was intimately involved, it seems, in the details of what was going to unfold on that day. There might be some there to these charges.
It's possible. See, the question is around the actual conspiracy and about what was being alleged and who the principal actors were. Because was Trump actually ordering these people to do so? We don't actually know the details of any of this. The other question is, why now? I mean, I've always thought this is the weakest case against Trump, or one of the weaker cases against Trump, barring whatever the hell Alvin Bragg was doing in Manhattan. But on a federal level, one of the reasons why the Georgia case, in my opinion, is stronger is that election law is rock solid on a state-by-state level. And in terms of trying to disrupt election proceeding in Georgia, there was the phone call that happened, the government officials that were there, and in terms of the jurisdiction over that process. Election certification is actually completely different from counting votes. Whether it's actually disrupting an official U.S. government proceeding also intersects with First Amendment law in terms of your ability to compel or to ask people to do, pretty much like in order to advocate for a position, even if one position is said false or does kind of get up to that line, really runs up against what a Democratic leader is allowed to say. So I think there's a lot more like novel interpretation of what was going on here. And same also in terms of those critical Oval Office meetings with Mike Lindell, with the Overstock CEO, and Sidney Powell and others. Who was doing the scheming, right? Like, was it a convening of like, what are we going to do? And of course, all of this matters the most if you are going to charge someone with a conspiracy to disrupt this proceeding and say it goes beyond the bounds of the First Amendment, wanting something to happen, to actively conspiring. And then the question of whether this is an actual, even in terms of certification, remember this, certification itself didn't matter, right? In terms of the Electoral College. It was one of those where even if Mike Pence, quote unquote, objected, not that I guess he had a right to do so, I don't know, whatever. But even if he had, it wouldn't actually affect the overall Electoral College regime. It wasn't actually going to disrupt any election results. So then does it count as consequential? I think these are all questions. I mean, I have no doubt a DC grand jury is going to indict him, or that, and that's another big one about fair trial and all of that. So it's a bit of a mess in my view, Krystal.
Yeah, I mean, listen, on the legal front, we're gonna have to wait and see what they have, what they're charging specifically, what evidence they have, because, if they're just hanging it on his, like, come to the Capitol on January 6th, it's gonna be wild, or whatever tweet he sent out and the comments he made on that day, which he kind of carefully, he said things that were insightful, is that even a word, that were incite-ish. And he also said some things to sort of like cover his ass there. I think that would be difficult if you're just talking about First Amendment rights. But if you're looking at some of the details of those meetings, it could be a very different thing. But, zooming out from the legal minutia, which we have a lot of questions on, the American public that does not like Trump and believes he's a criminal and believes he should be held accountable for his crime, this is actually at the core of their concerns about him. And I think justifiably so. I mean, there's a lot of overheated rhetoric about democracy that Democrats don't seem to actually believe based on how they conduct themselves in other situations. But it is true, as Keystone Cops-like as this attempted insurrection was, Trump genuinely wanted to overturn the results of this election. I mean, it was a direct assault on the basic functionings of our democracy. And so in terms of public sentiment and what would be just, this is the core of the potential crimes that the American people care about. Even as illegally, potentially the documents case may be more open and shut. I mean, he has very little left in terms of, really ability to mount a defense on the documents crimes because it's just so clear-cut that he was in violation, he's caught on tape, et cetera, et cetera. This one, the charges, they might be a little bit more difficult to actually prove in a court of law and put together the evidence. But these are the ones that are at the core of the things that the American people really have an issue with Trump on. And, the fact that it's in D.C. matters. I think the fact that, again, some of these charges have stuck to January 6th rioters matters as well. Because to me, it's disgusting that I've got no love for the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. Many of them really genuinely thought of themselves as patriots. Many of them were there because they thought they were doing the thing that Donald Trump wanted them to do. And so I do find it sort of disgusting that the lowest level actors on that day end up, in prison, end up being held accountable for their actions, and the top level people who brought them there and encouraged the whole thing would get off scot-free.
I think that's actually a good point. In terms of look, I think you're right politically that it is true. I do think legally that this definitely is crossing into some very interesting territory, and also will compel a lot of different questions around free speech, the Supreme Court, executive privilege, etc. So I think the documents case remains the strongest one against Trump. We will see also as to the question of why it took 3 years to apparently gather X amount of evidence. I mean, politically, if you want to, we've talked about this before, but the time to strike was then, during impeachment. And really because this is such a political matter, not in the documents is not political. That was just genuine Trump moronical idiocy. This is very much more up to interpretation. And that's why I think it would and should have been dealt in the political system, of which Republicans had their chance to have impeachment. And look, I will withhold, entire commentary on this before we actually get a genuine indictment. But Biden administration seems to be going forward, even though he isn't actively declared candidate. If you're Ron DeSantis office, I guess you should be doing backflips. You know, who knows that this one may actually work. Well, so not in the short term, but in the long term. In the long term, it might work, right? It actually, he literally might be thrown into prison or disqualified from running for office. And if that's the case, then he's the clear alternative. But in the short term, this is only going to further increase the support for Donald Trump in the GOP primary.
I mean, there's no legal path here for barring him from office, right? You can be in prison and technically run for office. You can be, you know, an indicted felon and run for office. So I don't think the political aspirations of Donald Trump are not going anywhere. And as we've seen before in the Republican primary, you know, they're with him no matter what. No matter how damning the facts, the evidence, whatever, they're with him. They have a very different view of what unfolded on January 6th at this point, and so that is what it is. I doubt that this is going to be useful to Ron DeSantis, even if he may wish otherwise. In terms of the legal merits of the case, we just got to wait and see.
Yeah, we'll wait.
I mean, we don't know what they have. We don't know what the charges are. We don't know the details. We don't know any of those pieces. So I'm just going to withhold judgment on the strength of the case, while saying again, I do think that these are the particular infractions and, you know, potential crimes that the American people feel are most at the core of their issues with Trump at this point. And I think that was reflected in the midterm elections
Politically,
as well.
Absolutely correct. Okay, we'll see you guys later.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.